Sacre bleu, you shot that man.
It was an accident.
Why did you shoot him again?
Canade, so unlucky. The sun was in my eyes.
I'm Aaron Brown.
I'm Jennifer Trujillo.
I'm Sila Blume.
I'm Nicole de Meneses.
I'm Aaron Prometer. And this is World Cinema History.
Mama's dead, don't wanna cry. Too much sun up in the sky. Going swimming, got my gun. Shot a man cause I was bored. At the trial, they don't care. If I'm guilty, it's not fair. Call me monster, call me stranger. Survive the heat, there is no danger.
In this corner, representing 1967, Luchino Visconti. In this corner, representing 2025, François Ozon. Today, we are throwing two adaptations of Albert Camus' 1942 novel, The Stranger, into the ring. Luchino Visconti de Mondre, Count of Lonet Pozzola's 1967 film starring Marcello Mastroianni versus François Ozon's new 2025 version starring Benjamin Voisin as Arthur Marcello. If you don't know the story, Marcello is a French Pied Noir in Algeria who goes to his mother's funeral, doesn't cry, goes swimming the next day with a girl, and later shirts an Arab man on a blindingly hot beach. But when he goes to trial, the state doesn't actually care about the murder. They put him on trial for his total refusal to perform the ritual of normal human emotions. It drops a big question right in our laps. Is flat, cold indifference the only logical response to a cold and indifferent universe? Or is this just an excuse for people to be pricks? Let's get some immediate reactions from the panel on how these versions hit all of you. I'm going to start with Aaron Brown. And Aaron, you were a big fan of Marcello Mastroianni and René Blier's performances in an earlier film that we did, 1963's The Organizer. What was it like seeing them reunited for the Visconti version of this story?
Honestly, I only recognized Marcello Mastroianni. I didn't recognize the other guy at all, which is unfortunate.
Sorry, he was the defense attorney. He was your
I
favorite character in The Organizer.
Yes, he was. I didn't recognize him. He was good in this too. Between the two movies, I preferred the 2025 version. The Italian version appeared that they forgot the characters were French, which sounds silly, but there's a difference in the way that they act. So they seemed way more French in the French version.
Well, it's in Italian for one.
Yeah, which is crazy. This is really stupid, but I didn't realize it was an Italian movie until they started speaking Italian, and even then I was like, what? That's not French. What are they saying? Is that Spanish? No, that's not Spanish. That's Italian. And then I realized it was an Italian movie.
One romance language versus another, right?
No, I felt like the characters didn't act very French in the Italian version. They seemed more like what I'm used to seeing in the Italian movies that we've been watching. And the French version, they were just so damn French. Just like very, very clearly, extremely French. Also, I preferred the character of Marceau in the 2025 version, Benjamin Voisin. His version seemed more realistic in the way that he wasn't showing what are considered normal human emotions. It was consistent throughout, with Marcello Mastroianni
He's
showing...
just so damn charming.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like he just was like a guy that didn't react the way they expected, but it wasn't weird except they were telling you it was weird. He didn't seem as detached from his emotions.
The biggest difference between the two, I think, is one version is kind of glamorizing that French-smoking, intellectual, existential indifference, and the other version is showing you a very negative character. And to you, the Voisin, the negative character, actually hit home because that felt more realistic, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. He stayed consistent throughout with his lack of emotions. Not that he didn't have them, he just didn't demonstrate them the same way as everybody else.
Nicole, you are actually a big fan of François Ozon's other films. How did you see his version of The Stranger kind of fitting into his canon?
Well, I think he loves a beautiful boy. You know, in this one, the man's like attractive nature, or just that he can move through life kind of carelessly. Like, I saw him like objectifying him in that, like, there's these wonderful God-eye views of him. Like, if this is about a man who is disassociated from society or isn't in control of his destiny, the way the camera frames him is very interesting. And I love the black and white look of the film. Even though I read something that was done for economic reasons, I thought it really added to, you know, the quandary, the emotional struggle the character goes through, or lack of struggle, because he is disassociating from his emotions. I thought it added to the story.
What are your opening thoughts in terms of comparing the two versions of the same story told by two different people? Keeping in mind, Visconti was also known for his love of a beautiful boy in his lifetime as well.
Same like Aaron, I did appreciate this version a little more in terms of it feeling more contemporary. It just the depiction of the two men, and maybe the depiction of their masculinity. One is more subtle and the other one is, the original, that actor is just very charming, and that does come through in the performance, but it's a different performance. So I did like the more subtle, kind of stoic or reserved performance, because I thought it added to the character. I can appreciate both versions, but I did lean more towards the newer version, liking the aesthetics more and also the tone a little more. Whereas the other one, and maybe because the other one was made in the 60s, it is funny to see some of the costuming in terms of male swimsuits, where he's wearing almost the same onesie as the woman that he is frolicking with. And like, I just, that
was actually a genuine 1938 swimsuit.
So feminine.
And so people used to dress like that.
Which is fine. If men can be feminine, it is funny when a movie is a part of its time, and then also this is when thinking about when the story was written, and so it is kind of interesting to see the two different versions. But I did like the 2025 version a little more.
In interviews, François Ozon had used Robert Bresson as an example of using the model technique of the non-performance from Bresson films such as our Balthazar, The Trial of Joan of Arc, and especially Pickpocket as his model for this Marceau. Is that?
I have no idea
Sila
Blume,
what were your opening thoughts about comparing the two versions of The Stranger?
When I listen to some of the comments from Aaron, I have to think of the problem with the first impression. Am I looking at this film to consider the difference in the interpretation, or am I looking at this film as cinema? For me, those are two completely different topics. And I kept just rolling with my head about how to approach it. So I started watching one, then I ordered the book in German because I wanted to do some comparisons in certain exclamations, certain phrases, just to see which different angles, because I find the book, the story is actually, it's actually written in a very simple manner. And I think you have to read it or watch it several times to discover how deep it is, because I think at first it's very, very light. I read the book in English, I started reading in German, and I watched the two films. The first impression I find very important, but I cannot choose that. I chose to watch the first one, 1967. As a result, when I started watching the new one, I had great difficulties accepting this guy. I think there are so many complexities and so many difficulties and so many decisions to focus on from the two directors, as opposed, number one, to each other, but also Camus, the way Camus means it. I think it has a lot of angles, what the directors did, as opposed to what Camus was actually intending to do, number one, as a thinker, philosopher, or existentialist, and number two, as a writer. Because I think some philosophers might see him similar to Nietzsche, more as a writer than a philosopher. There are so many little things that appear insignificant. I discovered the second time around that it seems to me there is a strong conflict between what a person loves and wants, as opposed to what one wants to reject. And these I see exemplified in the three characters Salamano, Raymond, and Marceau. All three are really fighting with these two sides of how to be. Salamano with his dog, and I found that very interesting.
Jennifer, it is interesting, though, that this is a film made by two openly queer men who became almost icons for their queerness in the film industry. And both of them are kind of doing a straight story. Was there anything that you saw on more outsider eye about an outsider story with having two queer makers deciding to tell us Marisol's story that perhaps somebody who was more considered normative in their sexual preferences might have told the story differently?
I did see homoeroticism and queerness in the 2025 Ozon's film, for sure. But there was a sensuality that ran across. I mean, I feel like the character Marceau in that was bisexual, pansexual, definitely with a lot of ennui. I also thought he read, the minute it started and he kept going, I'm like, this dude's autistic. Like, he's autistic. And then as it went, I'm like, he's autistic and queer. That's how he read to me. I don't know that all of the subtle, some not so subtle, but some of the homoeroticism and the sensuality might have gone past some people, because he's definitely, to me, the character comes across as pan or bi. He has a sensuality in a lizard brain, sort of animalistic way, I think, not in an aggressive way, but just in he knows, right? There's things he felt so ambiguous about. I don't know why. Like, he was definitely that, and the sensuality for him came through as pretty consistent. Aside from his morals or his thoughts about stuff, I just really felt like he read, as I said, autistic and queer to me. Of the two films, I foolishly, my mistake, I clicked on the links originally and saw the black and white, and I was like, oh, that must be the older one, and I started it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Has this been remastered, and how do they do this? And I didn't look.
How are they shooting in digital in 1967?
I mean, I have to admit it. I totally did that. And I was like, but it's a lush, the shadows, it's a beautiful film. Like, I thought, cool camera angles, cool shadows, cool use of the black and white, way to make even ugly things have some gauze of prettiness and sensuality about them and some contrast through it. I liked Ozon's film better of the two. I thought the characters were more interesting and fascinating to me. I did watch it first, and then it's interesting. And the films were paralleled in a lot of ways, you know what I mean? Like, from the book and then from the two films. It's definitely like a remake of the film. I'm kind of glad I watched it the way I did, or maybe it might have gone better if I'd watched the old one first and then I really liked the new one, because the older one was harder for me to stay focused on or be invested in.
Just from a you knew what was going to happen standpoint, or
I know
from a filmic standpoint?
it's a great question, but filmic, I think. Both. I mean, I sort of knew it was happening, so it was interesting to see the two tellings of the same. It was really a good comparison piece, but I also didn't like the performances as much. I didn't like the choices. I mean, they used a lot of dark. I mean, I had to put the brightness and the contrast up on my screen to appreciate some of the,
Some of that is because it was a lost film, and the print that I had, this is why there's a version of it on YouTube now. The film is in copyright hell because the Camus estate didn't want it to be released on video, and so every version you see of it is bootleg. Even the 4K version that I sent you on YouTube is off of a bootleg DVD. But there isn't a good version of it as far as seeing the black, because Visconti was a master of pitch black in color photography, and you lose that because, of course, there's some muddiness because we don't have an original negative to go off of.
I mean, I was able to crank up I did see that I was losing something and in increasing the brightness. on my screen, I was able to see more of the contrast. So I watched it probably flooded too high towards bright to get those contrasts and shadows that you said in the color. So we did pull some black and white concepts. I could see that through color. I didn't realize Nicole had said that the 2025 they did by budget. I felt like it would be a way to do it, to keep a gauze over it, and also to be able to make whenever they film 2023, 24 or whatever, look like, back in the day, easier.
They also had to get permission from the Camus estate to redo the film. And so they had their blessing, but they also had problems with Ozon's version also.
So I usually just try to watch the film cold, just like I do with all sorts of stuff. Like when I get a submission, I watch the film without reading the director's notes or anything else.
But you had read the novel, you said, back in high school or college?
Oh my God, and that was so long ago. I can't wait to talk to you about that, because you were very moved by it. And I feel like I was at the time, and I remember going down a rabbit hole of what even Sila brought up, of thinking of this piece and bringing it up when we were discussing philosophy and other concepts. I don't know that the novel hit me the same way it did you or others. I mean, I guess I'm not a cis male. I am probably on the spectrum, different in that way. So I remember the differentness of it.
We're not going to diagnose a fictional character from 1942 with an ailment that wasn't even diagnosable then. Camus is not writing for an audience of 2025 queer women.
What gravitates Ozon to making this film is he wanted to make something contemporary, or to speak on either whatever male loneliness or fragile male ego, or that like men today feel lost or something, but he was working on a whole other project. But doing this adaptation allowed him to tap into those themes or explore that in a way that felt personal to him.
And more importantly, the Camus name got him a budget, which he couldn't get for the project he was actually attempting to do.
So I find his version more interesting, that he was trying to tackle it from a more personal place, that he was interested in those themes, and it also gets, for you two, having the relationship to the text, and so you're coming in already with that knowledge. Someone like me who are like, I hadn't read the story, and when I think about stories kind of like this, the one story in terms about like existentialism that I think about because it makes me laugh is the Bartleby story. Like, I would prefer not to, like a passive character that exists in the world and that is unconventional. I gravitate more towards that story, but this character, he's intentional, and his intentions have consequences. But
whether you read The Stranger or Catcher in the Rye or Walker Percy's a moviegoer, I mean, Marcello became so much part of the zeitgeist in the second half of the 20th century that the character still is recognizable to you as an archetype that Camus created, whether you read the Stranger or not. I mean, Holden Caulfield, with his hatred of phoniness, is an American vulgarization of Camus' philosophy in Catcher in the Rye, which we all had to read in high school.
Well, like watching this movie, and like especially the trial sequences, they're so aggrieved and offended that he didn't act appropriately around the death of his mother. But you have the sister in the courtroom, and you want them to be asking, you took a life, and you took a life of somebody that they all consider to be a second-class citizen, only referring to him as the Arab. And so, I mean, for me as an audience, that's where my outrage goes, and I wish but I see the point of they're not addressing that because they're focused on this other part of the story, and why and how he's not adhering to the society that he's a part of, and how the hierarchy of that society, the race and the other part of that story isn't at the forefront. It's in the background, and it's important, but it's not at the forefront of this story.
Let me get into my history with this novel, because I do have a lot of respect for it, but for a long time I considered The Stranger to be a rather shallow book. I considered people who held it up to be somewhat superficial. It looked like a manual for those detached hipsters like my father, who used to run around before I was born in a black turtleneck with a cigarette and hang out at the little poetry bars and that detached cool. But in college, I finally got to read Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death. Kierkegaard, of course, the grandfather of absurdism, which is the philosophical school that Camus identified himself with, ironically wrote a book called Sickness Unto Death without one single funny joke in the whole book.
You suck. Bulls are not scaring me. I know most of you are not ghosts.
And it was in Kierkegaard and his idea of despair. And the worst layer of despair was a despair so deep that the person is completely unaware of it. Finally, the novel clicked for me. And finally, I realized that Camus actually was talking about something deep. It wasn't about that superficiality. Rousseau wasn't cool. He was walking a spiritual flat line. And the older I get, the more the novel seems relevant to me, because the world has come more and more to resemble Marceau on that beach. And so that's why tonight's double feature really matters, because I do love the Visconti version and I deeply respect the Ozon version. But both of them ultimately flinch at the thing I found deepest in Camus, and that is that flat line. Both have seemed to have chosen their version of what Kierkegaard would call a leap of faith, that once you face that void, you have to leap into something familiar. In Kierkegaard's case, it was religion, into some social pattern in order to keep it from being sucked into that void of cold loneliness. In Visconti's case, he leaps into romanticism, glamming up the void, making it look very attractive and stylish. And that is why you had so many people who would interpret Marceau as almost like an anti-hero. And they would consider him the ultimate rebel because he is rebelling against these silly arcane traditions. You must cry at your mother's funeral. You can't go swimming the day after her funeral. Visconti makes that look very, very attractive. He had originally wanted to cast the French actor Alain Delon, who probably would have been perfect for this role, but instead we get Marcello Mastroianni, the Italian actor, who had been basically playing this role since he appeared in White Nights, also directed by Visconti in 1957. And to me, the Visconti film worked because of my experience with Mastroianni in films like Fellini's La Dolce Vita, where he plays the cigarette-smoking, detached, indifferent, cool kid. In a film like Michelangelo Antonioni's La Notte, where he plays a cigarette-smoking, detached novelist during an existential crisis. In a film like Fellini's 8½, where he plays the cool, detached, cigarette-smoking film director. I don't need to go on. You understand. And to me, The Stranger was the ultimate version of that, where he had, despite the fact that he hadn't actually wanted Mastroianni for this role, he was able to create around Mastroianni this cool version. But that is, I don't think, true to the text. Ozon, on the other hand, leaps into intellectualism. I think he over-rationalizes the text so that it makes civic sense. But neither film had the stomach to just let us sit there with the unadorned vacancy of the text. But the reason I think the Visconti version comes closest is something that Sila was talking about, how the novel was written in a very terse, very plain language. And Visconti keeps the narration. So, the opening line, my mom died today, or maybe it was yesterday. That's gone from the Ozon version. And so you don't have that tertiary of language. And
I
you
like
understand.
Well,
made it feel more detached for me that character, that we don't get his inner monologue in the newer version, and I like that creative choice.
I found that Ozon was extremely, extremely intent on making an art film. The music in the background is very, very artsy, and a lot of elements or camera angles. For me, it's a very, very strong dedication to modernity, where the first one, to me, is straightforward. And they might be Italians, Visconti's Italian, the actor is Italian, but I had no problems with that. But I found the artsy aspect of the second one extremely strong. It didn't bother me, but it was very, very clearly different. Where outside of that, when I think of the book, the details, the old mother in the jail with her son, both films are quite strongly dedicated to the narration of the book, and I found that very good.
Let's look at the book and look at where it comes from. You have to understand what Camus was doing in real life. Marcello wasn't purely an abstract philosophical concept. He was based on Camus' friend in Algiers, Pierre Galando. True to the story, when Galando's mother died, he straight up refused to do the emotional theater society expected. He didn't cry, and he wasn't acting heartbroken. He was literal. For this, he was considered somewhat odd, which is, I think, a lot of people's interpretations, including a couple of people on this panel, of the 2025 version as perhaps being on the spectrum. But Camus watched this and realized something terrifying. Society was panicking more about a guy who wouldn't fake his feelings than they would about an actual killer. If you don't weep at a funeral, you're a monster. If you kill someone but cry in court, well, at least you're playing by society's rules, to Nicole's points. But let's look at 1967, and Visconti gives us Marcello Mastroianni in that crumpled suit he clearly slept in, and he looks so effortlessly detached. To Jennifer's point, Visconti is someone who loves beautiful men, and he looks incredibly beautiful throughout the entire film, and he's almost glamorizing this detachment. And for a lot of film buffs, this is the definitive Marceau. He feels like the logical endpoint of those guys I spoke about, Mastroianni playing throughout Fellini and Antonioni. And it's easy to kind of mock that cool, hipster, nihilist trope in our modern day and age, but for that post-war generation, that, like my father, that quiet, polished detachment with a defensive armor. The world seems so loud, commercial, and fake, and they use that style and silence to strike against the system. They were checking out. They weren't checking out because they didn't care. They checked out because the whole social script at that point felt like a con. Then we get 2025 and Ozon's version, and the romance is completely stripped away. I spoke earlier, but Ozon goes full Robert Bresson here, a flat, cold, anti-dramatic performance. And it's totally Breckian. It's a mask. You aren't supposed to like this kid or find him cool the way we did at Mastroianni. You're just supposed to sit there, watch him exist, almost like a brick wall. But Ozon makes a massive creative pivot in the very last scene of the film. He names the victim, Musa, and gives his sister, Jamila, actual screen time and emotional weight at his brother's gravesite. Suddenly, at the end of the movie, Marceau didn't kill a nameless archetype on a beach. He destroyed a specific family. By doing that, Ozon retrospectively shifts the entire landscape. The cosmic absurdity gets watered down. It stops being an existential crisis about an indifferent universe and becomes a story about a callous asshole who murdered someone's brother. Camus' own daughter said the changes to the ending were made to satisfy wokeism. That's an exact quote. I think this made...
Ouch.
I know, right? The irony is that it actually makes Ozon's film feel incredibly conservative because the trial at that point, no longer in retrospect, feels like the surreal farce that Camus wrote and starts looking like actual functioning justice. Now, I still have a real soft spot for Visconti's version. And I grew up in a time when that kind of cool, detached indifference felt genuinely edgy and rebellious. Ozon's colder take, though, forced me to confront things in the 1967 film that I had romanticized. And for that alone, I think it is a very worthy film. The notion that Marceau completely freezing up and refusing to show a shed of feelings. Is this a guy who is generally wired differently, or as people have suggested on the spectrum, or is this just a guy who forgot his hat on a brutal 95-degree day and refused to say he was sorry after committing a brutal act? We'll start with Aaron.
The 2025 version, he definitely read more autistic than the 1967 version. In both cases, people react differently to grief. And not crying at his mother's funeral, he could have been in a fugue state. He could have not... It didn't hit him yet. He was numb. But as it went along, it could have also been very deep depression or even dissociation, where he didn't feel real. So it could have been a lot of things. And it also could have been he's just an asshole. And he's just using the dissociation as an excuse to be an asshole. I don't know why he shot the guy on the beach. That was weird. And it could have been because of the hat, or it could have been because he could.
He told us why he shot the guy on the beach. The sun was in his eyes.
Correct.
Yeah, but that's not a reason to shoot somebody.
No. In the scene, it is.
Uh-huh.
Because the reflection
that you guys
of the
are getting
knife...
to the absurdity of the original novel.
Well,
That's legitimately is what happened.
That's just one of the absurds.
The knife reflects
There's
the
a
sun.
lot of absurdity.
He shoots him, but then he shoots him several more times.
Yeah.
Well, the reflection blinds his eye, and he talks about that a lot from the beginning in terms of Marie, and in various situations he addresses in terms of the reaction during the day of the funeral. There's something you have alluded to a lot in the last few minutes, and that is, for me, there's a very strong combination. I don't know what Camus wanted with that in terms of his philosophical points, in terms of literature, and in terms of the story taken from a friend of his. Added to that, when I think of Kierkegaard is thinking with the support of his belief in a very strong Christianism, where Camus is not. And Camus is actually, he's from Algiers himself. So those are two very different ways of dealing with this topic. And when we talk about, was he trying to rebel? No, I think he was simply, he feels, you could call that a spectrum. He simply is being very sincere, and Marie says that to him in both films. That's why I love you, because you're strange, you're different to the other ones. He simply feels, and I agree with him, there is no logic to crying. The only reason we cry is because we get sentimental, but that's not logic. So he is not, and we see them in both versions, the way he looks at the people laughing, he doesn't understand what's going on. He has no clue, because he's being sincere. He has even said it very explicitly. Why lie? He's a pure person.
I want to interrupt for just a second. The main evidence against him, the pause between the first shot and the last four shots, is only something the prosecutor knows because Marcello told him.
But why wouldn't he just let his friend Raymond, like, he stops his friend from having a gun. He's like, if he pulls a knife and you could shoot him in self-defense, but he takes the gun from him in the first altercation. What you'd think, if he's so indifferent though, what would he have cared if his friend had pulled the gun instead in that first altercation?
That's why they laugh in the court, because when he says it was coincidence, they don't understand that is exactly what happened. It was a coincidence that the reflection of the knife blinds him, so he doesn't know what's going on, and he tries to defend himself because he's afraid. But it was not intentional that he took the gun to kill this guy. So the whole different factors get mixed up, and the audience takes them as what it is. But I think it's all a lot of coincidence. The sun was too hot.
I don't think he was afraid though. I think he's indifferent. He's indifferent to human life until his own life is about to be extinguished, and then he cares about
That's
life.
That's true.
That,
yeah.
Well, definitely in the Ozon version. But what's wild is that both Visconti and Ozon yada, yada, yada over the most revealing piece of the novel and the most absurd and farcical section of the novel. In the book, the prosecutor builds this elaborate circumstantial case that Marcel murdered the Arab as revenge for Raymond's earlier stabbing. and they are trying to turn a sun-blind, heat-stroke impulse into a coherent revenge plot. Meanwhile, Marceau's own explanation, the sun was in my eyes, sounds insane to everybody else, but it is the actual facts of what happened. And this is so plain in Camus that I don't understand why time after time extremely smart people, Jean-Paul Sartre himself, misinterpret that act as being something more than a guy who forgot to wear a hat on a 95-degree day on a beach.
He alludes to that many times, yes.
He's not lying. He's just describing the reality he's experienced it, and the absurdity of it is that his version of the truth is the truth, but no one will believe it. And what he does wrong is he can't tell the little social lies that will allow people to understand what actually happened.
And that's when he says, he uses the word boredom, which of course is the wrong word to use in this context for the people, but it is true. He's actually bored by seeing how these people are reacting to so many things, and he has no clue why they're connecting those two things.
Both versions also cut most of the subplot about the press and the prosecutor's attempt to tie Marceau to a completely separate case, a guy who murdered his own father. And the logic there was essentially, this man didn't cry at his mother's funeral. Therefore, he is the moral type who could commit patricide, and thus he's responsible because his kind of indifference is contagious, which is, in the novel, not only very, very important, but also the root of how absurd the whole court proceedings is. But both versions cut this out. And by minimizing those elements, both movies actually make the legal system look far more rational than Camus had intended. And I am linking this to next week's episode, where we're going to discuss two versions of The Trial by Franz Kafka, which was a huge influence on Camus for this novel. I don't think it was intentional on Visconti's part, but I do think that Ozon was actually attempting to take away the absurdist element of that court, because he was trying to take away the excuse for people to just use small e existentialism and large a absurdism as an excuse for their own shitty behavior.
I need to know what you mean with that he took that out, because I noted, I made actually one-to-one, a couple of notes one-to-one to a certain back and forth in the courtroom, which I think is extremely important to exemplify exactly what you're talking about that they took out.
Well, for instance, he takes out the scene where the judge pulls out a cross and refuses to believe that Marceau is actually an atheist and is holding the cross in front of him, which Visconti, to his credit, left in. So that judge, it becomes a comical figure and a figure of ridicule in both the novel and the Visconti version. In the Ozon version, the judge is actually acting as a reasonable arbiter of justice, and the actual verdict seems just and seems fair with the facts that we are given.
Yes, okay, I agree with that. But I'm thinking furthermore about this. I hope I get this right. So the judge says in Ozon's version, the last one, there are things we do not grasp about your person, and you must help us understand. So he's being very, very normal. And then later on, a few minutes later, they're asking the boyfriend of his mother, did you see him cry? No. Did you see him not cry? No. I mean, so the absurd must be a layer of critical beings, in my opinion. And the absurd has got to be an element of how one reaches existential thoughts. And to me, this is extremely clear in that section. Is he being accused of killing an Arab or of burying his mother? That's a question that comes also in the courtroom. And the lawyer sums up the case by saying, The sum of this case is that everything is true and nothing is true. This man buried his mother with crime in his heart, said the other lawyer. So those moments there are so clearly absurdity.
I would agree with that, but what is missing is, and Visconti does, I think, a better job of this, is that link between the state and, in the novel, the press, being unable to tolerate the idea that a man killed somebody simply because the sun was too bright and his soul was too empty. So they invent a monster to fit their narrative. I don't think Ozon made a mistake by doing this, and I don't think it makes the film any less as an adaptation, because he's creating a different work of art for a different generation. Because I don't know how you would sell that idea in 2025 when that kind of indifference has almost become the norm as opposed to the exception.
Okay, but again, with the term rebellion, that is if we use that lens to watch the film and to see Marceau. And I cannot see him as a rebellious person. And once we put him as a rebellious person, we are seeing a different film.
Yeah, and that's a Visconti flaw, I think, is he allowed Marceau to become a symbol of rebellion, which Camus never intended. To use a modern example we'll look at, say, Kyle Rittenhouse comes, if from one side of the spectrum, a heroic defender of order, or from another, a bloodthirsty vigilante, or Luigi Mangione becomes either a folk hero striking back at corporate greed or a cold-blooded assassin. But in both cases, the actual chaotic human reality gets buried under our need as a society to give a soul to that bullet. We pour our own prepackaged fear and rage into the figure so we don't have to sit with the weightlessness. And we don't have to understand the indifferent mess that caused the sun to kill that man on that beach in 1938. And I hear this anxiety all the time. I hear it at church. I hear it at Starbucks. Everyone seems to be convinced that the world is right now on the brink. The right thinks that culture is dead. The left thinks our rights are evaporating. I live in a state that didn't legalize interracial marriage until the 1990s. And I ask, when I look at a 2025 film of a 1942 novel taking place in 1938 in a colonial state of France that is now a free country, when was that golden age? Was 1942 better, or 1992 better? I mean, or when 1967, when this film was made in the United States, lynching was still a thing. In 1992, gay people couldn't even get married. What are we comparing things to? Or are we just terrified that the world is actually functioning normally and we have no idea what to do with the quiet? We fought for decades for the right to be the stranger, to be Marceau, to turn our back. We won. Now what? And that's my question.
I don't think anyone wants to be Marceau, though. Like, no one is trying to be this indifferent asshole that can kill at because the sun gets in his eyes.
And the whole thing could have been avoided had Marceau just worn a hat that day. Just saying.
Yeah, but that's the absurdity of drama. Yeah.
Well, because a hat doesn't win you a Nobel Prize. It just keeps you from pulling the trigger, right, Sila?
I don't have a gun and I don't have a Nobel Prize, so I don't know what you're talking about. Don't forget the name of the book or the novel, The Stranger, and in some translation it is called The Outsider. So,
but Camus didn't like that translation. He preferred The Stranger.
Yes, but I'm sorry to say this. I like Camus very much, but he has no right in this matter because English is not in his DNA as French or any other language might be. That plays a big role in the whole handling of the film. He was an outsider to society. He's not being bored because he would prefer to be doing something else. He just doesn't get why we do the things we do.
Just because this movie, both films center around the crime and killing of, and I do think race played a part of the killing, even though it's not a big part of the narrative. It's the background.
100%.
It's the background to the story. But I was thinking of the real world case. It's a current case that's going on with the killing of Austin Metcalf, and two young people where it's a senseless crime. The one person, his name's Carmelo Anthony, had a knife, stabbed Austin Metcalf, killing him in his brother's arms. It's a terrible tragedy. These both young people, it's a senseless death. Now, people want answers on why this tragedy happened, and so far they're coming up with, well, wrong place, wrong time. He was threatened. It was about race, and they are struggling to try and find the meaning in this tragedy. So, just in terms of a real world event, while watching this movie, I couldn't help but think about this real world tragedy.
We can't explain it to ourselves as being meaningless. We have to give meaning to it.
There's that. I also think I think race is playing a part in it, and how media manipulates the story plays a part in it. And so it will be interesting to see how things work out in the legal system. Yeah.
And Marcello's lawyer in both films, but not in the novel, says you're not the first Pied Noir to kill an Arab, and you won't be the last. And so both films,
I think, that was heavy.
Both films were made in post-colonial Western society, and both films are reflecting that. Where, of course, in 1942, when Camus wrote this, that was just the way things were. And just like we think things now are going to be like this forever, so did Camus. I don't think he could foresee a time when Algeria wouldn't be a part of France and the native Algerians being second-class citizens. There, I think Ozon does a good job of updating this to a post-colonial society. I don't think Visconti does as good a job driving that home, but I think it's because he was trying to make a different point. He was selling us on the absurdity. He was selling us on the detachment because he still saw that as to the point that Sila argues, a form of rebellion. But I do love the Visconti film, but I love it at the end of all of these existential films about these types of characters. Last year at Marienbad, all of this. And so I'm not seeing it as being a reflection of 2025 reality. I'm seeing it as in 1967, at the end of all of these existential, and we went through these characters in The Road to the Godard and how they constantly are reacting against society by turning their back on society, and how cool they all look with their cigarettes and their leather jackets. Or Marlon Brando in The Wild One. What are you rebelling against? What have you got? But this is exactly the type of thing that I think led to things like Ayn Rand's objectivism in the 1940s, taking this idea of existentialism and saying, I am so important that these social rules that you are making me follow are actually inhibiting me, and by inhibiting me, you are inhibiting society. But Camus always grouped this in what he called his trilogy of the absurd with his play Caligula. They, to him, were twins from the same absurd family. So Marcello sees the universe as meaningless, and he goes for a swim and refuses the social script. Caligula is Marcello with power, and he sees the same things and decides that if nothing matters, he might as well become a god and destroy everything just for sport. But in Camus' absurd universe, the temptation isn't just quiet detachment. It's the active revolt that says, since nothing has meaning, I can impose my meaning by force, by deals, by spectacle. And everything becomes like the Parasite movie to Donald Trump, purely transactional.
By the way, how bad were the Academy Awards this year? Did you see it? And the winner is a movie from South Korea. What the hell was that all about? We got enough problems with South Korea with trade. On top of it, they give him the best movie of the year. Was it good? I don't know. You know, I'm looking for like, where let's get Gone with the Wind. Can we get like Gone with the Wind back, please? Sunset Boulevard. So many great movies. The winner is from South Korea. I thought it was best foreign film, right? Best foreign movie. No, it was did this ever happen before? And then you have Brad Pitt. I was never a big fan of his. He got up and said little wise guy statement. Little wise guy. He's a little wise guy.
Art, loyalty, tragedy, even human life, all are just negotiable props in his game show. There's no shared value. There's no space outside of the transaction. There's no art. You know, he looks back at things like Gone with the Wind and says, why can't Hollywood make more movies like they did in 1939? It's just the same logic of Marceau, but pushed into power.
I don't think they're that closely related. I haven't seen the play. I don't know the play.
Well,
or in
is
game
a man
shows.
who has realized that there's no meaning to the universe, and he has decided that because there is no meaning to the universe, he can impose whatever meaning he wants on that universe. And he is followed by sycophants who allow him to do so. That is the plot of Caligula.
Okay, and I think in that case you're giving the game show host too much credit for being aware enough to consider the universe as having no meaning. He just wants whatever he can get, no matter the cost. He doesn't care who he hurts. He doesn't care what he destroys. He wants everybody to see him as the best and the most amazing, and he wants all the money and all the power, and he doesn't care about anything outside of that little sphere.
Give me credit, because the game show host may not be aware of the universe's meaninglessness, but he is smart enough to charge admission for it. And he is smart enough to exploit the growing consensus that these societal rules that Camus was protesting against are things we no longer consider to be valuable in this society. I guess this is where both films kind of failed me, because the Camusian revolt was to stare into that meaningless and still choose lucidity, solidarity in life. That was the message that Camus was attempting to give us. And by 1967, that had been corrupted into the universe is this great big void. My life is meaningless. Why do I have to do what you tell me to do? Which seemed radical in 1967, and now that is the political platform of one of the two major parties in the United States. So that they are, to me, connected.
I'm not going to say you're wrong, but I think there is different intent behind both. I don't think the current dystopia we're living in is because anybody thinks it's meaningless. I think it's because there's power to be grabbed and people to be exploited. And that's not the same as... I'm not going to speak to Caligula because I haven't seen or read it. I know what you said about it. I don't think that applies in this case. If we're going to compare him to Marceau is just a guy that doesn't fit the alleged social norms. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I don't agree, basically.
Walker Percy predicted this exact evolution from performative indifference to transactionalism in his novel The Moviegoer, where he has his existential hero, Binks Bolling, say, "Money is a better god than beauty. Money is a good counterpose to beauty. Beauty, the quest of beauty alone, is whoredom. 10 years ago, I pursued beauty and gave no thought to money. I listened to the lovely tunes of Mahler, and I felt a sickness in my very soul. Now I pursue money, and on the whole feel better." So since 1942, there is a vacuum. And what the game show host has filled for a large enough majority to get him elected president twice is that vacuum.
My theory about how that bastard got elected is there's backlash to a black man being in the White House. I think it's all backlash to that and somebody with the ability to exploit it.
But would he have been able to exploit it in a society that still had a at least polite decorum, where you couldn't go around and say, there's a black man in the White House, we have to do something about that. He can't even be an American.
I am in a world of shit.
Do you see Meursault's DNA in today's performative, transactional difference, or has this school of thought always been a convenient mask for people who simply want to win and wish not to be troubled about who gets hurt? Is such indifference contagious, as the press and the prosecutors say in both Camus' novel and these two films? Was Camus warning us, or was he selling us indifference?
I think we're giving too much credit in the political and intentionality sector to this book. He is addressing a problem, and for me, it's very, very simple, and that is that Meursault, in this case, even though some of us might like him or not, in this case, this guy is just living a life which is very normal for him. And the absurdity of the whole thing is for us to see how society reacts to his purity or to his normality or to his weirdness or to his spectrum. And I think it's a mere display, the same way Gustav Mahler or Franz Schubert would use Winterreise or Winter Journey to demonstrate what happens when you walk through the fields, or to demonstrate the absurdity of how my society, and as we know, is not French. In the picture he's portraying of how society is handling this man who's not doing what we expect him to do, he's an outsider. Camus himself is an outsider.
In his foreword to Caligula, he said, and I quote, "Some who found my play provocative also found it perfectly natural that Oedipus should kill his father and marry his mother, and that threesomes should take place as long as, of course, they do so only in the neighborhoods. For my part, I have little time for that special kind of art that chooses shock for lack of knowing how to convince. And if, as luck would have it, I was being scandalous, it would be solely on the account of that inordinate appetite for truth an artist can't abandon without giving up on art itself." He also, sarcastically, called Meursault the only Christ we deserved. And honestly, this is a sharper joke than anything you'll see in his novels or plays, or even on late-night TV. It's a corrupt idea. The world is broken. So this is our Savior. We didn't want a Messiah to carry our sins. We wanted a mirror to validate our own coldness. We got a guy who wouldn't play along with the social performance. So we destroy him just to prove we still have some collective power left. Jesus died to give the world gravity. Meursault died to prove it's entirely weightless. In 2026, we've completely lost the ability to tell the difference, in my humble opinion.
Well, I know you want to use the Caligula comparison, but like I think a more apt comparison would be like if you're comparing like the nihilism in Fight Club, where there's no life has no meaning, but still these fragile men need to form this club where they beat the hell out of each other and then also commit acts of violence and terrorism, and to either fill that void that they have. A lot of people miss the point of Fight Club, and they're rooting for the wrong people. Eric, I feel like you're rooting for the wrong person in this film. How do you watch this film and root for Marcello?
I'm not rooting for anybody in this film. Also, I'm not trying to tie this to Caligula. Camus was. His trilogy of the absurd with this, the myth of Sisyphus rolling the rock up. You picture Sisyphus has this one task where he rolls the rock up and the rock falls to the bottom, and then he has to roll it back up. And he ends that essay with, "You must imagine Sisyphus happy," and then Caligula. That was the trilogy that Camus himself imposed. I am simply taking Camus at his word. But no, I don't root for anybody in this film. And I may have rooted for Marcello when I was a young 15-year-old, but by the age of 16, I thought he was a shit. And it really wasn't until I read Kierkegaard and understood that idea of a despair so deep that you're unaware of it being despair, that you live every day unknowing that you are in the void, that I finally understood what Camus was doing, and that he was not putting Marcello out as a hero. I'm saying quite the opposite. I think, and especially by tying it into Camus and Sisyphus, that he looks at Marcello as a ridiculous figure, and that sarcastic idea that it's the only Christ that we deserve. What Camus is actually saying is that, you guys are all pouring your own observation and your own misgivings into this empty void that I've created at the center of this novel.
I'm thinking about absurdity in the context of your question about what was the intention of Camus. And as I have said several times in this show, that to find something funny, you need a certain distance to it. In the same way, to see something absurd, you have to see it with a certain distance to be able to see the absurdity of it. Otherwise, you feel offended or something else. And the point at which Camus also makes a very interesting display of this absurdity, if you are observing it with the right distance, is the conversation with the chaplain towards the end. The point about God existence and not existing between these two, that conversation is really, really absurd if you see it as absurdity. If you believed in God the way society generally sees it, you're not going to see absurdity in that conversation.
Camus said, "Man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." And that's a quote from Camus from The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays.
Amen.
Right?
And Camus would have hated this episode, because one thing he hated was turning the absurd into a political weapon. But he's the one who took Kierkegaard's philosophy, broke off the cross, took the Christianity out of it, and sharpened it into a blade. I'm just using the tool Camus left behind.
I would argue that possibly, only possibly, Kierkegaard would have been influenced by Camus if their lives would have, been chronologically different.
Perhaps, but instead we had Camus reading Kierkegaard and taking his philosophy about the void and about the absurd, and then Camus' conclusion about the leap of faith, calling that suicide. He basically called it jumping into the void. And I don't think it's unfair of me to, all of these years later, use Camus as a bludgeon against those who have taken his philosophy and said completely the opposite of what he was trying to prove. He was trying to prove that the universe is cold and indifferent, and we have to react within it, and they have taken from it the cold world is cold and it's indifferent, and I can do whatever the fuck that I want.
Correct, because if Marceau would have said, he would have kneeled before what's her name and said, I'm really sorry that in this problem with the sun and the heat, I killed your brother, and I'm really sorry about. And if he would have cried in courtroom and said, I just realized you have opened my eyes that I really, really miss my mother. If he would have said a lot of these things, he would not have died.
The character doesn't feel sorry for anybody but himself. He would he would never say that. It doesn't come to him.
Because he doesn't know the state of being sorry. In my
I
Which would
don't.
be
opinion.
why
I
I
don't
think
even think.
Ozon's choice to use a Browsonian model at non-performance works really, really well for 2025. Because I can't 100% believe somebody as charming as Marcello Mastroianni doesn't have the social vocabulary or the awareness to be able to tell at least the little white lies that we tell each other to get by in society. I could believe that Benjamin Voisin in the 2025 version.
Well, that's why it works. I think the film works better with a younger protagonist, because a younger protagonist doesn't have that lived experience and also might be that selfish and, or self-involved.
But this goes back to Aaron's point. His refusal to perform, to use performative empathy, is what costs him his life. Whereas
I have problems with that. He's not refusing. That's his nature. He's not refusing anything.
okay, his inability, would that be a better way of putting
Yes.
it?
Yes.
Okay, so his inability. So the indifference of the society that I was speaking of about that guy that we don't like to talk about is performative indifference as well. They're performing the act of I don't have to have empathy for anyone. And to Aaron's point, it was a reaction to having a person of color in the White House. It was a reaction to things moving too fast. And it was also a reaction to the internet and people who maybe never had a chance to read Kierkegaard running across a meme of the myth of Sisyphus and saying, I totally see myself in that, without realizing that Camus was touching on something that he had come to by reading Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, and that there was an actual soul there. The soullessness of the kind of reactionary movement that's going on now is just performative. And in a lot of cases, it is performing a role that I don't think any of those people actually created intentionally. I don't think that Camus would look at this as being a rebellion against an unjust society by refusing to play against their rules the way this has been interpreted now. And that's why I say I really did, despite it not being a great adaptation of The Stranger, I think the Ozon version is a great film because these are the thoughts that went through my head after seeing it and allowed me to question not just my own reaction to the novel, not just my own reaction to the 1967 film, but my reaction to this almost performative indifference of the society that I'm seeing grow around me today.
I had some thoughts on Merceau being the whole moment of it being an accident. I mean, I think he had this through the whole thing, his inability to connect, his inability with his emotions, but sort of this connection or fascination with things that were different or absurd, like the bugs or the other stuff. And I feel like it wasn't an accident that he went back down the beach, right? In Ozon's film. I felt like it was a deliberate choice. It wasn't, he made a choice to befriend the pimp with the asshole neighbor and then to help him multiple times. And the going to the beach with him also was a conscious choice. But then once it started after the confrontation, I think he had a fascination with it. I don't know if there's a parallel but I thought some love. Like, if I remember some of the philosophy of Camus, there was this level of, there was a possibility to escape, the pushing the boulder up the hill, the challenges of life, that life is difficult and weird and bizarre and hard. Suicide could be an escape, but suicide would also be a surrender to the absurd, like just an acceptance, which I feel like
Should
the
I kill
Marceau.
myself today, or should I just have a cup of coffee, as he
Yeah,
famously said?
right. Well, I feel like Marceau was kind of that way. And then even in the film, you show sort of the hesitation, and then he goes and his girlfriend comes out, "Are you going to go?" And he's like, "I'm going, right? I'm going with them. I'm going back down the beach." In the end, yes, the sun in his eye with the blade, you could make that a defense of, he wasn't sure what was happening. He had to defend himself. He shot. And then he shot 4 more times. The shot 4 more times. Once the sun was out of his eye, he wasn't.
That's a Jean-Paul Sartre interpretation of this.
Yeah.
And this is why I think, as I said, Ozon, I think, made a great film, but not a great adaptation, because he has created a logic that both the 1967 film and Camus' original novel didn't. He has
Wait.
and it makes it a much more conservative version of this story, because you can kind of put these things together. You were not supposed, it was a random act. This notion that we have to find a reason. Why did he walk down that beach? Well, because the sun was hitting him in the wrong way. Why did he get the gun from him? Well, because that's what happened. We can't accept that. And so, in the Ozon film, he gives he makes it so linear and so intellectual that you lose the absurdity of the actual act.
I don't know that I agree with that, in the sense that I thought he made Marceau making choices, but not for a reason, out of absurdity. Like, why not? Or, I don't know why. For a minute at the beginning when he was doing the guy, I'm like, here we go again. Boys will be boys. Like, he's fascinated with this guy that's an asshole, that's beat his girlfriend, or the guy that beats his dog. Like, and then
he drifts. He drifts from one bad situation to the other because he doesn't make choices in the novel, and because he makes choices in the 2025 film.
Oh no, he's making choices, but I don't know that they're deliberate choices for a reason. I think I see what you're saying. There's some choice out of morbid fascination or connection or whatever it is, or wanting to observe the car crash of it.
There's something that drives him. There's some morbid sense of completion in the film. That was not the intention. However, again, I'm not saying that as a flaw of the film, because how else are you going to tell this story in 2025? It doesn't make sense outside of 1942. After the Holocaust, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what is the significance of a guy drifting from one place to the other? We all have to make choices. And so maybe it's a flaw, which I love the 1967 film. I've seen it several times, but a lot of that is the notion of the existential hero and the sexiness and the cigar and the cigarettes and how beautiful Marcello Mastroianni is, and a continuation of this character that he has been playing. And a lot of it is simply because Visconti, by staying so literally to the text, doesn't try to make any sense of it. Whereas the new version, like I said, if I were going into watching this not having read the novel or even seen the 1967 version, I would probably consider it to be a lot deeper than it is, because it is a lot more emotionally intelligent and intellectual than the 1967 version, and actually far more intellectual than Camus' novel itself, which, as Sila and I have been stressing, was written at a very terse level and written at a not very intellectual level on purpose in order to get his philosophy across.
No, it's very subdued, the novel. The text, the way it's written, is very, very simple.
What Ozon does that I don't like is when he takes the absurd bits of narration and plays them out, but he doesn't play them out completely. So, for instance, he has him seeing his mother on the hill with the guillotine, talking about the time his father had gone to see an execution.
I'm not sure I like that.
I don't like it because it's a shortcut, and it's also a shortcut. Sila, as someone who's recently read the novel, he continues with a very absurd notion that they should come up with a way of executing people that only works 9 out of every 10 times, so everyone had a 1 in 10 chance. That's the absurdity of it, and that's what he was setting up with that scene. That's cut out. I didn't like him talking to his girlfriend through the jail bars about the story that he read about the man who had left his hometown when he was a child, then got rich, and then came back to surprise his mother that he was rich without telling him that he was his son. And then the mother and sister beat him to death with a hammer and then robbed him. And his saying, well, the guy deserved it because he didn't tell the truth. Because in the novel, that as narration is around his thoughts about the absurdity of the trial. It is not something that it was spoken to people. It is seen as the weird kind of thoughts that he has as he's panicking about his own death. I think Visconti, by cutting those sequences out, by realizing that they weren't filmable because they were about mental state, which you just can't show on film, I think did a smarter thing than Ozon by including them, but not including, shall I say, it's like he told the joke but never told the punchline.
When you were talking about sort of these choices and not choices, I mean, I think these characters, like you referred to earlier, like Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, or isn't this the state of human, of man, woman or man, of sort of existing through life with its, I mean, life is crazy and absurd on some level. Like it's good and bad every day. It's the extremes of life and death every day, and existing through the ups and downs of all that, you sort of go through. And I think there's a perspective of somebody going through life. There was something in the last month that it just really struck me that someone was talking about. They say to another person, oh, as the state of our noon meeting being changed, it's now at 1:00 or whatever. And someone who thinks of life as I'm a passenger in the car and I'm moving towards a meeting would think of the time perspective of where the meeting originally was as a different time versus someone who is a passenger in a car and thinks, you know, oh, Christmas is hurtling towards me. You know, right now we're already at summer and Memorial Day's coming and Christmas is coming. Like the world moves at them, and there are different people who are more proactive and more directive. And then other people who are more passengers. But irregardless of that, we're still drifting through life, trying to make sense of the life, of the death, of the good, of the bad. And we keep having these characters in philosophy and in books like Holden Caulfield or like Marcello in these two versions of the film. I was thinking of a film, Less Than Zero, which I was thinking about books that struck me the way, you know, Camus, The Stranger struck you when you were young. And I remember reading, you know, Catcher in the Rye and having it strike me, or this book, Less Than Zero, that came out in the 80s, I'd say 85 or so, where there's a young character.
Easton Ellis.
Yeah, Bret Easton Ellis. And it's about these kids that are just seemingly immoral and living not a bohemian, but like a hedonistic drug. They're drifting in the same way and letting things happen or things happen.
And Ellis does acknowledge in the novel several times that The Stranger was a big influence on him.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I don't know that I connected that then or now, but now I am. And then there's even a movie on that, but I'm saying that's part of the human condition. And some of us pivot between passenger and driver, or, you know, active or passive in day to day or in any situation. And there are definitely people that we know in our lives that are entirely passive or victim mentality, or they are just sitting and life is happening. They don't make any choices.
Well, we talked about Godard failing upward.
Yeah, there you go.
Marceau
I was
failed
going to go
downward.
there. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you want to flesh that idea out more, but I get where you're going.
No, because I just thought of it. I hadn't given it any thought until it happened to be because you were the one who said Godard failed upward, and hearing it again in your voice, it clicked.
Yeah, and I'm feeling it. Like I saw this, and then I happened to see another film we're going to watch, and I'm like, oh, we're going to go down this whole philosophy thing again, and that's part of what telling stories on screen is. Like, what is your perception of life?
Well, and then because you did do the advanced homework, you see why I tied these two episodes together. Then,
yeah, I do.
No spoilers. No spoilers. Sweet.
Interrupt.
I did want to talk about the queerness of these two men.
Yeah.
Both Visconti and Ozon are prominent queer directors, and Jennifer and Nicole are both here. And I wanted to kind of look at this through the same lens of performative transaction we've been using all the way through this episode, because it always struck me with the 67 film, and it struck me with this as well. Marie feels largely decorative, beautiful, available, affectionate, but mostly there to highlight Meursault's emotional flatness. And this is something I see a lot in Visconti, of either his female characters being ciphers or basically men in drag, a male character that has become female. Now, Ozon does give Giacomo a real weight and moral gravity in that ending scene, which is a meaningful change, but all the other women seem to orbit Meursault's indifference rather than existing within their independent lives. But some of that, of course, could go back to Camus, who wasn't known for his particularly enlightened view on women. But here's the tension I keep burning into. Two queer male directors working in different eras, both making films about a man who rejected emotional performance, yet the female characters still feel like props in a male existential drama. Is this just the nature of adapting Camus, or does it reflect something deeper about how even outsider artists can reproduce certain blind spots around gender and emotional labor? Am I overthinking this, or does this connect to the bigger question of who is allowed to opt out of society's emotional script and who is still expected to perform within it? Hint, hint, women.
I think Ozon is restricted by the fact that it's an adaptation, but he managed to make it personal to him in telling a story he was interested in previously. Yes, the women do feel like props, but that's the nature of an adaptation. These are the characters that were laid out in the story. Jen had brought up that Marceau might be pan or bi, and it would explain his connection to Raymond, and that he does lots of things. He does lots of favors. Why does he gravitate towards him? Why does he spend time around him? He's definitely the opposite in somebody that leads with his physicality and his vices, and it would make more sense if that was the stand-in for the love relationship, or at least like seeing his opposite, projected, and that he wants to be around him even if it's negative because he's the other and he can't achieve that. But the women are written the way they were written, and it's unless another person wants to come in and flesh out those characters, where like the sister could have been fleshed out more. Again, it's not her story. We're not going to get to hear from her or Marie, and really we're all like, Marie, girl, get a clue. Get out of this relationship, Marie. What are you doing? This guy doesn't want to marry you. Don't marry this one. Those are other stories for other films. They're not going to get to exist in this property, or if they do another adaptation. But I think if Ozon had a little more creative leeway, I could have seen him pushing the queer envelope a little more and making Raymond and Marceau more of an item. And that would be interesting.
I would definitely watch that fan fiction. Jennifer, your thoughts?
I agree that is that makes it a little more interesting and intriguing. I wonder it's the whole perspective of the audience, in the sense, like, I agree the women were not primary protagonists. They were ways to point out the story of Meursault and his perspective on life and to highlight things, but they did give us some depth in a little bit, of her longing or continuing to be sweet, but it mostly was ways to point out stuff. Like, it's a little weird in that he cared or not cared. Like, even in prison, he's like, oh, you can go be with someone else. Like, yeah, he's going to be dead. I would hope so. Like, she could have already started to be with someone else while he's in prison and still have an attachment to him. But I guess she's going to stay loyal till he was executed.
Another social
construction, right? Yeah.
Construction.
But also him giving permission to that. You would think he wouldn't even care. He was just bizarre. I mean, there was some level of his carnality, which this is really perverse, but I don't even know if you noticed in the cell when he was sketching into the wall, that there were breasts in the wall and even a female laying prone with her legs spread open, etched into the wall.
Yeah, I saw that.
Those were mountains. Those were mountains.
Yeah, no, of course they were. I watched this film in the theater. Those mountains had nipples.
Well, there were the mountains, but then there was also the prone.
And areolas, just saying.
Well, there was also I can't even repeat it because it's a quote from a film that might be in the film festival comparing female genitals to a splayed open plate of pasta, which is you could see in the other sketch on the wall. Right? I was like,
Mamma
wow.
mia!
Well, I just sat that this week and then I saw that etching on the wall and I was like, okay, this all makes sense to me.
Well, I hope more people see Ozon's version because it would probably make them go down the rabbit hole of seeing the original and then probably reading the book, and which I think is a successful, trajectory. Ozon in other interviews had said like his version of Marceau was allowing people to. He was a blank slate. He was allowing people to project their own insecurities or feelings about the story onto him, and it was connecting with younger audiences. And so I think his original intentions are achieved in his adaptation, and if it leads to more people learning about the original source material, all the better.
Now, I still think I prefer the 2025 version because it just felt more natural, and Marceau is a dick. And it was just kind of depressing. And honestly, now that I know that there was a whole subplot about the press trying to make a big deal out of this and connect him to other articles, it's like, I wish they had included that. That would have been very interesting to have, because that would have made it make more sense to me as being absurd. The closest we got to it being absurd to me was in the 67 version with the crucifix in his face. I think I kind of wish the absurdism had been more enhanced, but that's just me.
Well, I don't think the novel was in your face about the absurdism either. Do you think so, Sila? I think it had its subtleties as well.
Well, it depends how you are, where you stand in terms of the perspective of absurdism.
We love Luis Buñuel, who took absurdism and surrealism and created great works of art that way. But he was wearing a sign that said, "I'm being absurd right now," whereas Camus wanted us to get the absurdity through the almost absurdly flat language he was using.
When I think of this, now that you brought Buñuel, for me, the Buñuel films, especially The Andalusian Dog, is about the absurdity of the individual, namely of the individuals, and what they're talking about, Dali and Buñuel. The absurdity in this film and in this novel, to your statement about how I saw the book, it has nothing to do with Marceau. It has to do with society. He is, and Bergman does that in some films. He is pointing to the absurdity of how society does things. He's not pointing to Marceau. And this citation or this quote, I remember my mother and understand why she took a fiancé. She felt free again. Nobody had the right to cry over her. This is for me, is a very clear explanation as to why he did not cry. His logic, his sentiments, his way of viewing life, and his way of living do not call for crying. Why? And when Marie says, "Do you love me?" he says, "That means nothing." It's not because he doesn't care. It's because I think he's correct in saying to say "I love you" means nothing. We might take it as something individually, but the statement in itself means nothing. It has never meant anything. It only makes a person or certain people react, but the terminology itself means nothing. So these films or this book are not about the absurdity of this man, spectrum or not. This book for me the story is about how absurd society reacts to such a normal person, normal in his realm, not normal in our realm.
That's why I wish they had that subplot about the press, because that would have been another example of the absurdity of this society that we're in.
Or at least had the when the prosecutor is doing the summation, had him trying to tie him to the patricide case. They could have done that without having to, because I do understand for budget reasons, you don't want to have to hire a bunch of press corps, and you don't want to have to, create a set with typewriters.
Some of the
but at
the
least,
wordings from the prosecutor is just
it's so funny. It is laugh
crazy.
out loud funny how he stretches this circumstantial case to say that he plotted to do this, and then, which is absurd enough.
And he went into his soul.
He accuses him of being responsible for the patricide case because somehow this rotten soul is contagious, even though the two never met.
I think it was a really interesting exercise to have for anyone that hasn't read the book or read a summary of the book and then watch the two films and look at the two different takes from storytelling, from scripting, and then also from visually and stylistically the way that they went about it. I thought it was a very interesting and fun exercise in that regard. Like the whole situation with the priest in the 2025 really made me think again about consent. I mean, no means no, dude, kept coming through my head when he was telling the priest, I don't want to meet with you. I've told you I don't want to meet with you. And now you're meeting with me and now you're shoving in my face. And it felt very much like a repeated assault to a guy who's trapped in a cell, right? And then they made it, go bring in the guards and pull him back. I'm like, you came in and went at this guy against his will. And then there was the whole weird twisting of the give me a kiss that could have felt like a kiss on the cheek or compassion, but it had this weird pausing moment of awkwardness in my mind that it just was weird in a tone of that same, almost not pederasty because of the same age, but of assault. It was weird.
Benjamin Voisin is 29, but looks like 14 in this movie, so it felt pederasty.
It was
in the
okay.
scene.
Good. I don't feel so bad. It felt that way. It was just
no. You were right in your instinct there, and I think Ozon was deliberately attempting to have us think about that.
And why would he have us think about that in your mind, regards to the plot? Just out of
because it's okay for certain parts of society to do this, but not others, because the priest is performing his formal role in society by doing this. So Rousseau is, in society's eyes, seen as the bad guy. But also, and I think he was making a point about the Catholic Church scandal.
Yeah.
With framing it that way.
I thought so too. And the whole, it was pretty funny. I mean, they didn't call me daddy, right? Like, I'm daddy. Keep that in perspective.
That's straight from the novel, though.
Yeah. But it also ties right into that, though, doesn't it? If you saw an opportunity to pull in the homoeroticism and a criticism of the church and its position.
Well, I think Ozon saw that in the novel and updated it visually but without having to actually change the actual dialogue. Because a lot of that has to do with the way the lines are delivered. Because the priest does feel like someone who starts out with a seduction and it doesn't seem to be going correctly and begins feeling like he has to force himself on him. And especially when you compare the 67 version to the 2025 version, you can see the priest becoming a predator.
Yeah.
In that scene, whereas you almost see the priest as being a victim in the 1967 version.
But that's the general idea, especially in Christianism, that to do missionary work, there's no need for consent. No, when the Jesuits go to Japan, or when the whoever goes to Africa and brings Bibles and brings bubble gum and whatever they bring, they are not asking for consent. They are convinced that it is the duty that God gives them to go and do their missionary work.
Yeah.
And that's very clear.
Righteousness, beyond righteousness.
In the Livingston Chronicles, someone says, if I had never heard of Jesus, would God condemn me to hell? And Livingston said, no, he's a forgiving God. Obviously, he'd make an exception. And so the African man turned to Livingston and said, then why did you tell me about him?
this absurdity can only function as absurdity depending on how close you are to the topic or how far you are from the topic.
And it should be noted that Camus, unlike Kierkegaard, is coming at this from a distinctly atheist angle.
It is for the same reason that Kierkegaard was very, very devout Christian and Camus was not. If Camus would have written and lived before Kierkegaard, there's a possibility that Kierkegaard would have played from the other angle and not.
And Christian existentialism sounds like a contradiction in terms, but the inventors of existentialism were Christians. It was a deeply Christian ideology.
Existentialism could be taken in very different contexts, yeah.
And we could get way into the weeds and say that Camus did not consider himself a existentialist.
Correct.
He took the absurdist part without the leap of faith from Kierkegaard and built his philosophy on that. And by the 1950s, he and Jean-Paul Sartre had completely fallen out over Sartre's defense of Stalin and Stalinism as creating an ideal worker state. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it's from one of the introductions to his plays where he says that dictatorships on the left and the right both criticize him equally. He wouldn't want to live in either. Because a dictatorship, whether it's a leftist or a right-wing one, whether it is a religious or an atheist one, is always just a bad place to live.
In the 2025 scene, the killing, how, clearly homoerotically charged that was? Did it come across?
Yes.
To you and to Eric?
Absolutely unnecessarily. I'm sorry. that armpit has no place in this film. I'm sorry.
I saw it as being a wink at his audience, at his normal audience.
Yeah. I mean,
I just saw it as I'm not going to say he was changing the scene to mean anything different by it. I think he was just stating, hey guys, I'm still here. You're still watching an Ozon film.
But perhaps the killing and that whole attraction to Raymond or his attraction, like his unknown or known attraction or draw to these
Which I think is the
men.
flaw of this as an adaptation, because he is giving too much logic to a story that is supposed to be completely illogical. These aren't supposed to make sense. It was just a weird set of events. It was, like he said, a series of coincidences in the original novel and in the 67 version. But I think he added depth to the film by doing this.
He may have put in depth of he has to kill this guy because it's sparking this knowledge of his homoeroticism type thing. Is that what you're getting at? That's out of the context?
I hadn't thought of that until this moment, and so I don't have anything smart.
Okay.
I don't have anything smart to say.
It's not fair. Call me monster. Call me stranger. Survive the heat. There is no danger.
Visconti gave us the cinematic icon. Mastroianni is the patron saint of cool, a detached outsider. And you can't help but romanticize it. Ozon is delivering the autopsy. He's cutting open the exact indifference and showing us what's inside. The moral of all three of these stories, wear a hat, people. Because those supposedly silly rules were the only real hat we had, and we tossed them into the surf 80 years ago. The white lies that we tell each other may be the only thing that keeps our society going.
A glorious catastrophe! Right, we've smashed the pretty pictures of your culture, vulture fixtures. Got no future, got no plan, just a feral modern man. So tear it down, don't feel no shame. Let's burn it down, it's all a game. Anarchy, pure anarchy. Anarchy for you and me.
I ultimately blame Robert Smith the Cure for making me read this thing at 15. Because he, of course, recorded a song called Killing an Arab that got me fascinated with Camus. I would like to take this moment to formally apologize to anyone who had to deal with me that year because it turned me into an insufferable prick. I'm just kidding. I didn't need Camus' help to become a prick.